Hello everyone, welcome back to the Zach GP channel, and in today's video I will be going over my post FP2 final thoughts for F1 Fantasy going into the Monaco Grand Prix. And like always, like and subscribe, as this is going to be hard and fast information coming your way to help you after FP2 bring in the best team selections and strategies for this race weekend. So as you can see, the side on the bottom, it depends where I put it, will be the point for every driver and constructor needs to get their budget gains or decreases this weekend. You can find all of this over at F1 Fantasy Tools, and this will be on the screen every single time I'm looking at you. So with that all said and done, let's head into the list of drivers and constructors you should be using this weekend. And if I don't mention anyone's name, it means you should not be bringing them into your team. So straight away we'll start with the A-tier drivers, and this race weekend it really is again only Oscar Piastri who you should be looking at as your A-tier driver. Now the other name you could have is Max Verstappen if you think he's going to have some brilliance. However, after watching FP2, I don't really have faith in him that much anymore. And then you have this weird, interesting one, as this isn't a driver I would recommend for a normal team, of Charles Leclerc. The Ferrari looks quite quick here. However, there is a weird strategy where it works to put Leclerc in your team. As Leclerc budget-wise isn't really an option, needing 78 points to go up 0.3 million, if he does get a surprise pole position and that Ferrari looks good after qualifying, you can do a swap for swap on Piastri and Leclerc. So you have the Piastri budget gains that you need, 0.3 million, easy peasy at -1, to Leclerc, who will then get you the points. And this is what I would do for anyone who wants to use Charles Leclerc as a sort of differential, because also it means you know full well, okay, if you're doing this, he's going to do well because you've seen qualifying results. But now onto the B-tier drivers, and it's the likes of Nico Hülkenberg, looks like one of the best assets in the game for budget building this weekend, with Pierre Gasly, my must-have this weekend for every single team, Alex Albon, Lance Stroll, Yuki Tsunoda as a differential, Franco Colapinto as he's at the price floor, and same goes for Bortoleto, as both of these assets can't go down. They're not really the best for budget building, however they're safe assets just to hold. And then a weird one again, I had to do this for Imola as well. However, if you have Isaac Hadjar and Carlos Sainz in your team and you need to take a -10 to bring them out of your team, these drivers I'd recommend just sitting on them for now, as I do think they'll still be able to get -0.2, and I think that's enough to keep them instead of taking that -10. Then onto the constructors, and A-tier wise, it really is the top dog McLaren, a must-have for every single team. And then this weekend after FP2, it very much looks like Ferrari, because guess what? Even if Ferrari aren't as fast as what they were shown in FP2, which was ridiculously fast, if they're just around the top 5, with 2 pit stops being mandatory, they have been the best on pit stops so far. They'll make it up on the points from that. So I really do have a lot of faith in Ferrari being the second best constructor this weekend. Now, again, sort of like the B-tier drivers, if it's one of those situations, however, if you need to take a -10 from Mercedes to Ferrari, I worry about it a little bit. And finally, if you are still budget building massively in F1 Fantasy, then that would be Williams as your top go-to team, as they still look like they're going to give you some pretty good points. And then Sauber, again, they're not going to get you any points. However, at 5.1 million and looking like a very easy way to get 0.6 million into your team, they also look half decent as well. But those are all of the drivers and constructors you should be using this weekend in any sort of variation. Now, I'll give you team selections in just a few minutes. However, I do need to talk about a few chips. And the first one that comes to my head is no negative. Now, I've had a lot of questions on this. Should we be using no negative in Monaco? There's plenty of crashes. Now, for me, there's this stat that averagely over Monaco since 2021, we've had around 2 to 3 DNFs at this circuit, which is quite high compared to a lot of other tracks. However, just to put it into perspective, in Australia and Miami, those weekends where we had very wet weather, which is where I recommend doing it, we have an average of 6.5 DNFs. So you can see why I don't think no negative, even at Monaco, is worthwhile, because it doesn't look like we're going to get any rain right now. Then onto Limitless, and again, I would only suggest Limitless if you ran the triple McLaren and Sauber teams in Imola. However, otherwise, I would not recommend this. I'll show my Limitless team, however, in the team selections in just a few minutes. And then, like I mentioned with Charles Leclerc, I do think Final Fix only recommended if one of the top drivers like a Piastri or Norris or Verstappen, if you had one of them in your team, does badly in qualifying, then you might want to Final Fix over to someone else. Realistically, the only option I really see being worthwhile at the minute because you can't use it with constructors would be, like I mentioned, if Piastri didn't get pole position and someone like Leclerc did, then that's the only reason I could see it being worthwhile. But now with this all said and done, let's head over to the team selections, and straight away I'm going to go off the near meta ones. Well, at least this weekend it looks like the meta, which is the Piastri, McLaren, Ferrari teams. Now the first team I'm going to show, it is going to cost 114.6 million, so a lot of people aren't going to be able to afford this. However, hold your horses, as I'm going to show each step down that you would need to fit these sorts of team variations into your team. So with Piastri, Gasly, Albon, Colapinto, Bortoleto, McLaren, Ferrari, this is my dream team this weekend. With McLaren and Ferrari looking so strong compared to everyone else, they look like must-haves this weekend. Piastri budget and points is safe. It also gives you that option to final fix the Leclerc. And then Gasly, the must-have B-tier driver, looks very good for budget building. Albon looks insanely credible at the minute, his form. I can't see why you wouldn't want him. And then Colapinto and Bortoleto, they can't go down in value. It works out brilliantly. But if you can't afford this team, all you have to do is get rid of Gasly and go down to Hulkenberg. And that would now cost 113.2 million. Again, Hulkenberg, one of the better budget building B-tier drivers. And hey, if you still can't afford this, then you could go over to having Piastri, Hulkenberg, Gasly, Colapinto, Stroll, McLaren, Ferrari. So you decrease Albon to Gasly, however you increase Bortoleto to Hulkenberg, so it's still a brilliant team, and it cost 112.4. And then finally, I can hear you screaming out, but Zach, I still don't have 112.4 million. If you still want to run the Piastri, McLaren, Ferrari teams, you can get one at 107.4, which would be Piastri, Hulkenberg, Gasly, Colapinto, Bortoleto, and McLaren and Ferrari. And this is realistically the floor of what you could be working with Piastri, McLaren, Ferrari, because if I think you have any less than 107 million in your team, you should still be looking at budget building with the likes of McLaren and Williams, which I'll get onto. However, with this variation as well, if you really don't believe in this hype that Ferrari have, or let's say you have to take a -10 or a -20 to get Mercedes over to Ferrari and you're not too keen on it, this is where all of the teams I have just suggested there, you can use McLaren and Mercedes, and instantly they'd become a little bit cheaper. So if you can't afford Ferrari, or you think some of these B-tier drivers need to change before you bring in Ferrari, just do that instead. And then finally, for budget building, like I mentioned, you should be using a team such as Piastri, Hulkenberg, Gasly, Albon, Colapinto, McLaren and Williams. Colapinto, the best 4.5 million driver for that budget building and being at the price floor. Gasly, like I mentioned, and Hulkenberg, the best B-tier drivers for budget building this weekend. Albon looks good on points and budget, and Piastri, again, the exact same thing. And this will only cost you 104.6 million. So again, if you're around that value, I would go for something like this. And the best thing about this is if you can't afford that, then you just drop Albon down to a Stroll, which would free up a lot of money, and you go from there. And then finally, team selection wise, I will show my limitless team, and at the minute it looks like this: Piastri 2 times, Norris, Leclerc, Verstappen, Russell, McLaren and Ferrari. Now I hear what you might be saying, why not Lewis Hamilton as well? And I just do think, especially with how much it can change over practice, don't have all your eggs in one basket. I do think if you want to go risk it for a chocolate biscuit, then recommending going for Hamilton, triple Ferrari, triple McLaren. However, I do think if you want to play a little bit safe, because you still don't know 100% what Mercedes could be like, then I'd recommend going with Russell, as he'd probably be the better one out of Russell and Antonelli. But everyone, that is all you need to know post FP2 for F1 Fantasy. Now, as always, I will be around in the comments for any questions you have. If you have any sort of question, F1 Fantasy related, F1 related, just shoot it down in the comments and I will get to you 100%. I normally get to around 90% of the comments, I would say, so you've got a very good chance that I'll get to it. Of course, I'll be doing a deadline live stream over on the Fan App channel, so you can find me there an hour before qualifying if you're still stuck. Then, if you want to join an F1 Fantasy League, over on the Featured League, you've got the Fantasy Formula with over 60k people in it at the minute, so thank you all so much for joining that. But for now, that is all. Now, a little few nuggets of information just to drop that don't really help you in Monaco, but just be prepared for. Antonelli this weekend, most likely looking like he could drop down to a B-tier asset, looking very good for Spain. And then again, Alonso will be at the price for 4.5 million heading into Spain as well. So those two, keep an eye on them, because if Alonso has a good weekend here and Antonelli has a good weekend, they could be the ones to look out for coming into Spain. But anyway, as always, I love you all so much. Enjoy the weekend, enjoy F1 Fantasy. Hopefully we get a good Monaco Grand Prix. Well, as far as Monaco Grand Prix go, take care, and I'll see you all on Saturday.